I genuinely, I mean, I've vaguely heard of Beyonce and Jay-Z, but I honestly don't know who they are. And everybody says the Cotswolds is being taken over by celebrities, and you just think, well, I don't see them.
I never see them either.
We don't see them. I look out of my window in the morning, I don't see them.
Fast cars, sharp jokes, and zero patience for nonsense. That's Top Gear. And at the center of it all was Jeremy Clarkson, outspoken, unpredictable, and never afraid to show when he'd had enough. While many celebrities laughed along, a select few triggered something very different. Awkward silences, cutting remarks, moments that felt less like banter and more like open contempt. Today, we're diving into 6 celebrity encounters that went wrong in ways viewers couldn't ignore, including one moment that sparked outrage far beyond the studio. What really happened, and why did Clarkson react the way he did? Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant's appearance on Top Gear is often remembered for one reason: how painfully obvious it was that Jeremy Clarkson didn't want him there. Of all the celebrity guests to pass through the studio, Grant managed to do something few others did. He completely broke the unspoken contract of the show. And Clarkson, visibly irritated by it, made little effort to hide his contempt. The problem, from Clarkson's point of view, was simple. Hugh Grant did not care about cars. On Top Gear, that is almost an unforgivable sin. The star in a reasonably priced car segment is built around enthusiasm, not necessarily knowledge, but at least interest. Even guests who know nothing about engines usually play along, feigning excitement and leaning into the fun. Hugh Grant didn't bother. From the moment Clarkson began questioning him, Grant's answers were flat, disinterested, and openly dismissive of motoring culture. He admitted he had no passion for cars, no particular interest in speed, and no emotional connection to driving. Instead of masking that indifference with humor, Grant leaned into it with dry, understated remarks that undercut the entire premise of the segment. Clarkson's patience wore thin almost immediately. Rather than adapting his approach, Clarkson became sarcastic. He mocked Grant's lack of enthusiasm, repeatedly highlighting how bored he seemed. Each question was followed by a sharper edge, and each response met with less tolerance. The playful ribbing Clarkson often used with reluctant guests was replaced by something colder, irritation bordering on disdain. What made the exchange particularly uncomfortable was the clash of personalities. Hugh Grant's humor is famously dry, subtle, and self-deprecating. Clarkson's is loud, confrontational, and dependent on shared excitement. Instead of complementing each other, the two styles collided. Clarkson appeared to interpret Grant's understatement as arrogance or contempt for the show itself. As the segment progressed, Clarkson stopped trying to engage him. He began talking over Grant, cutting short his answers and steering the conversation back to pointed remarks about how dull he found the guest. Even when discussing Grant's lap time, usually treated as a moment of celebration regardless of performance, Clarkson framed it with faint praise at best, bordering on mockery. After the episode aired, Clarkson made his feelings even clearer. In later interviews, Clarkson described Hugh Grant as the most boring guest we ever had on Top Gear. It was a blunt assessment, delivered without irony. Unlike other guests, he teased on air, but defended afterward. Clarkson offered no such balance here. The message was unmistakable. Grant had failed the show, and Clarkson had no interest in softening that judgment. From Clarkson's viewpoint, Grant was the kind of celebrity that he did not like at all. He was the one who came to the show just for the sake of promoting his movie, and had no regard for the culture or audience of the show. To Clarkson, Top Gear was more than a talk show. It was a festival of cars, speed, and visual delight. Grant's non-cooperation was perceived as an insult by him. Although that perception wasn't the only one, the audience was divided on this issue. There were some who suggested that Clarkson was too hard on a guest who simply did not take an interest in his topics. Others saw it the other way around, saying that Grant's unpretentiousness was a breath of fresh air, that it would have been more hypocritical to act like one was interested in cars. From this point of view, Clarkson's outburst was considered small-minded, up to a point where he was an impatient brat, and it showed how very little room he had for guests who were not his type. This incident is of great significance as it takes away Clarkson's signature excuse of treating everyone the same way. Hugh Grant was not ridiculed for being powerful, contentious, or provocative. He was ridiculed for being dull. Rather than adjusting to the situation, Clarkson chose to show his disdain. There wasn't any shouting match, no formal complaint, and no lasting animosity. However, sometimes disdain doesn't require the presence of fireworks. At times, it is only the silence, a refusal to be involved, a hardening of the tone, a determination to stop caring whether the guest feels at home or not. Hugh Grant's Top Gear appearance serves as a constant reminder that Clarkson's patience had limits. If you were passionate like him, you would be welcomed with open arms. If not, you would be ignored. And that was exactly what happened in the case of Grant. He was lit off during a live broadcast, and hence, it was very hard to overlook. That one tested Clarkson's patience, but the next encounter crossed a completely different line. Madonna. Madonna's appearance on Top Gear should have been television gold. She was one of the biggest pop stars on the planet, a cultural icon known for reinvention, controversy, and an unshakable sense of self. On paper, she was exactly the kind of guest who could thrive under Jeremy Clarkson's sharp tongue. In reality, the segment exposed one of the clearest examples of Clarkson's open disdain for a celebrity, and this time, it played out in full view of the audience. From the outset, Clarkson's attitude toward Madonna felt unusually combative. While Top Gear interviews were rarely reverential, there was typically a baseline of mutual respect beneath the insults. With Madonna, that baseline was missing. Clarkson's jokes weren't balanced with admiration or curiosity. They were pointed, dismissive, and persistent. One of Clarkson's primary targets was Madonna's accent and mannerisms. He repeatedly mocked her Americanisms and played up the idea that she was pretentious, artificial, and overly self-serious. Rather than letting her answers breathe, Clarkson interrupted her frequently, steering the conversation back toward ridicule whenever it threatened to become genuine. Unlike some guests who pushed back aggressively, Madonna responded with a mix of defensiveness and forced humor. She smiled through the jabs, occasionally offering curt replies, but the tension was unmistakable. This wasn't playful sparring. It felt like two people talking past each other, neither particularly interested in meeting halfway. Clarkson also made little effort to hide his disdain for Madonna's celebrity persona. He framed her fame as manufactured, her image as calculated, and her success as something that didn't deserve serious consideration. In doing so, he leaned into a long-standing bias he has often displayed, a deep skepticism toward global pop stardom, especially when it clashes with his own tastes and worldview. What made the segment uncomfortable wasn't just what Clarkson said, but how little he seemed to care whether Madonna was enjoying herself. With many guests, Clarkson clearly calibrates his insults to keep the atmosphere light enough to remain entertaining. With Madonna, he didn't bother. The jokes kept coming, even as her discomfort became more visible. The car-related portion of the segment did nothing to soften the tone. Rather than using Madonna's lap time as a chance to inject enthusiasm or encouragement, Clarkson treated it as another opportunity to downplay her performance. There was no attempt to celebrate her effort or connect it to the broader fun of the show. The underlying message was consistent. She didn't belong here. At the moment, the audience's response was conflicting. While some people thought that a megastar was actually a good match for Clarkson's playful attitude, and they saw the segment as a brave refusal to give in to fame, others thought that Clarkson went overboard, and that the interview was more of a confrontation than a comedy. The fact that people still argue about it shows how much the dialogue was cut compared to the usual Top Gear exchanges. Madonna did not provoke the matter, but her careful and withdrawn attitude during the whole segment, I would say, that it was a comment. She was not like the other guests, who would laugh out loud or somehow accommodate Clarkson's nuisances. She seemed rather skeptical, as if she was getting ready for the next blow instead of enjoying the moment. This happens to be an important issue, because it is here that we see the least generous side of Clarkson. Neither was there an effort to locate a middle ground, nor was there any interest in finding out who Madonna really was beyond her caricature. Clarkson wasn't taking her on, he was turning her aside. And that difference is very important. Madonna is an exceptional case in the list of guests, where Clarkson displayed his contempt consistently throughout the time with a guest who was more powerful and famous than him. Instead of changing his attitude, he seemed to be encouraged almost by the chance to overpower her with his words. The interpretation of the segment as funny or uncomfortable depends mainly on the interpretation of Clarkson's role as a host. If he is deemed a provocateur, then the Madonna interview was a triumph. If he is considered an entertainer who should never alienate his guests, then he failed. Anyhow, it is still one of the instances where Clarkson's dislike was not implied, exaggerated, or retrospective. It was live, unavoidable, and at the very core of the conversation. Lionel Richie. When Lionel Richie appeared on Top Gear, it should have been an easy win for the show. He was a global music icon, a crowd pleaser, and exactly the kind of celebrity guest who usually slotted neatly into the star in a reasonably priced car segment. But from the moment he sat down opposite Jeremy Clarkson, it became clear that this was not going to be a friendly exchange. What unfolded instead was one of the most awkward celebrity appearances in Top Gear history, and a rare case where Clarkson's disdain was impossible to hide. Clarkson has always insisted that his on-screen insults are just jokes, applied equally to everyone. But with Richie, the tone felt different. Rather than playful teasing, Clarkson's remarks carried a sharp edge, repeatedly undermining Richie's relevance, age, and career in a way that left little room for warmth or mutual respect. Almost immediately, Clarkson began leaning into jokes about Richie's age. He framed him as a relic from a bygone era, quipping that Lionel Richie had been famous before cars were invented. The line drew laughter, but it also set the tone. Clarkson wasn't interested in celebrating Richie's achievements. He was positioning him as outdated and irrelevant. From there, the mockery continued. Clarkson poked fun at Richie's music, dismissing it as soft, bland, and uncool. Unlike the usual light ribbing aimed at pop stars, these jokes didn't come with any counterbalance. Clarkson didn't express admiration for Richie's success or longevity. Instead, he treated it as something faintly embarrassing. The message was clear. Clarkson didn't take him seriously. What made the segment especially uncomfortable was Lionel Richie's response. Rather than pushing back or playing along aggressively, Richie remained polite and composed. He laughed off the comments, smiled through the jabs, and attempted to keep the atmosphere light. That contrast only made Clarkson's behavior stand out more. Without resistance, the jokes landed harder, drifting from banter into something that felt one-sided. As the interview went on, Clarkson continued to assert control over the dynamic. He interrupted Ritchie, talked over him, and steered the conversation back toward ridicule whenever it threatened to become sincere. Even during the lap-time discussion, usually a neutral, fun part of the segment, Clarkson managed to frame Ritchie's performance as another opportunity for dismissal rather than encouragement. This was classic Clarkson, but with an extra layer of hostility. With some guests, Clarkson's mockery feels inclusive, a way of pulling them into the show's anarchic humor. With Ritchie, it felt exclusionary, as if Clarkson had already decided that this was someone unworthy of respect. Behind the humor was a deeper tension rooted in Clarkson's long-standing disdain for celebrity culture that doesn't align with his own tastes. Clarkson has always been open about his dislike for pop music, modern stardom, and what he sees as manufactured fame. Lionel Richie, despite his undeniable talent, represented exactly that world. On Top Gear, Clarkson didn't just poke fun at him. He used the segment to signal his own cultural snobbery. What's telling is how fans reacted. Viewers were divided. Some found the exchange hilarious, seeing Clarkson's treatment of Ritchie as refreshingly blunt. Others described the segment as uncomfortable and unnecessary, arguing that Clarkson crossed the line from humor into disrespect. The fact that the reaction was so polarized speaks volumes about how obvious the contempt was. Unlike other Top Gear controversies, there was no formal complaint or public feud afterward. Lionel Richie didn't lash out. He didn't criticize Clarkson in the press. That silence, however, doesn't soften the moment. It sharpens it. The lack of response leaves Clarkson's behavior hanging, unchallenged and exposed. This is why Lionel Richie belongs on this list. Not because of a scandal or explosive argument, but because Top Gear captured something rarer. A host who seemed genuinely uninterested in being gracious to his guest. Clarkson didn't just tease Richie. He dismissed him. In a show built on outrageous humor, that dismissal stood out. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was subtle, persistent, and unmistakable. And in many ways, that made it worse. If that exchange made you shift in your seat, keep watching. The next name changes everything. Jonathan Ross. Jonathan Ross was no stranger to Top Gear. Unlike many guests who appeared once and vanished, Ross returned multiple times and was already well established as one of Britain's most recognizable television personalities. On paper, he should have been one of Jeremy Clarkson's easiest guests to handle, confident, media-savvy, and comfortable with sharp humor. Instead, his appearances exposed a different kind of tension, one rooted not in awkwardness or ideology, but in rivalry, ego, and irritation. Clarkson and Ross occupied a similar cultural space. Both were outspoken, provocative broadcasters known for pushing boundaries and courting controversy. That similarity mattered. Clarkson has often been most hostile not to people beneath him, but to those he sees as peers, especially peers who command comparable attention and influence. On Top Gear, that dynamic played out in subtle but unmistakable ways. From the outset of Ross's appearances, Clarkson's tone was different. The jokes weren't introductory or welcoming, they were undermining. Clarkson repeatedly mocked Ross's chat show persona, his love of celebrity culture, and his perceived ego. Rather than laughing with Ross, Clarkson laughed at him, framing him as self-important and indulgent. Ross, to his credit, tried to meet Clarkson on his own turf. He fired back with self-deprecating humor and leaned into the absurdity of the situation. But unlike guests who gradually settled into Clarkson's rhythm, Ross never quite found solid ground. Each time he attempted to steer the conversation, Clarkson pulled it back with sarcasm, ensuring he remained firmly in control. The tension became most apparent during moments that usually function as levelers, particularly the discussion of lap times. Clarkson often uses this part of the segment to soften his tone, celebrating effort even when performance is mediocre. With Ross, that generosity was notably absent. Clarkson downplayed his result, framed it dismissively, and quickly moved on, denying Ross the moment of shared enthusiasm most guests receive. The primary cause for the discomfort in this interaction was that it was not perceived as a mere coincidence. Clarkson seemed to want to wound Ross's self-esteem by constantly pointing to the fact that it was not Ross's show. The fun was not chaotic or playful, but was rather strategic. Clarkson resorted to irony, interruption, and mockery to re-establish his power as the dominant one. Though it was not an outright clash, it was also not a case of a friendly exchange of words. Rather, it was an uncomfortable situation where irritability was just under the skin. The entire scenario probably seemed like the heights of popularity were nothing special for Ross, who remained very comfortable in the place of the Top Gear format, and even refused to be impressed by it. The audience's mood seemed to share that indecisiveness. While some viewers had a kick out of watching these two large personalities battling in the way, and even considered the interchange a war of egos rather than a sign of enmity, others were more observant and noticed Clarkson's sharper edge, thus concluding that Ross was less warmly treated than equally important guests. Ross's returning to the show did not clear that impression, but rather strengthened it. This aspect of Jonathan Ross's appointment to this high-profile position makes it so significant. The contempt of Clarkson was not shouting and unfurling here. Instead, it was quiet, consistent, and calculated. He did not directly insult Ross. Rather, he used his power to belittle Ross. Clarkson has always had a very good sense of hierarchy. Who is the boss? Who influences the mood? Who gets the most attention? With most of the celebrity guests, that hierarchy was very obvious. With Ross, however, it was not, and Clarkson reacted by reaffirming his authority, making it very clear who was in charge of the story. This episode, in the larger picture of Top Gear, shows a different angle of Clarkson's temperament. He was able to deal with boredom, awkwardness, and even confrontation. But equality was his Achilles' heel. Whenever a non-deferential guest came in, Clarkson's endurance became less. Jonathan Ross did not leave the stage in a huff. There was no public clash or grand split. Nevertheless, the discomfort lingered. It was seen in Clarkson's terse way of speaking, his unwillingness to give way, and his constant desire to diminish. It was contempt conveyed not through outrage, but through domination. And sometimes that kind of contempt is the most revealing of all. George Michael. George Michael never sat in the Star in a reasonably priced car. He never traded banter with Clarkson in the studio. And yet, his name became permanently entangled with Top Gear because of one line, a throwaway joke that revealed exactly how far Jeremy Clarkson was willing to go for a laugh and how little he cared about the fallout. The incident occurred during a car review segment, the bread and butter of Top Gear. Clarkson was reviewing a high-performance Jaguar, and in typical fashion, he wasn't content to talk purely about horsepower or handling. Instead, he reached for an analogy, one that instantly crossed from automotive humor into personal insult. Describing the car's tendency to slide its rear end, Clarkson quipped that it gets its tail out more than George Michael. The joke landed hard, and not in a good way. At the time, George Michael's sexuality had already been the subject of intense media scrutiny following his 1998 arrest in Los Angeles. While many comedians and presenters avoided referencing it directly, Clarkson leaned straight into it. The line wasn't subtle, clever, or layered. It was blunt, lazy, and unmistakably aimed at ridiculing Michael for his sexuality. What made the moment especially revealing was Clarkson's delivery. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't nervous laughter or a quickly retracted comment. Clarkson said it confidently, with the expectation that the studio audience and the millions watching at home would laugh along. And many did. That response was part of the problem. The backlash was swift. Critics accused Top Gear of homophobia, arguing that the joke reduced George Michael to a stereotype and used his personal life as a punchline. Viewers lodged complaints with the BBC, and the incident became yet another entry in the growing list of Top Gear controversies. George Michael himself did not stay silent. In interviews and public comments, he made it clear that he found Clarkson's remark offensive and emblematic of a broader culture of casual homophobia in British media. He described Clarkson as pig ugly and condemned the joke as cheap and discriminatory. Unlike many celebrities who ignored Top Gear insults, Michael responded directly and personally. Clarkson's reaction, or rather lack of one, is what cements George Michael's place on this list. There was no on-air apology, no moment of reflection, no acknowledgement that the joke may have crossed a line. Instead, Clarkson carried on exactly as before, treating the controversy as just another example of people being too sensitive. In doing so, he sent a clear message. Not only did he not regret the comment, he didn't care who it hurt. That indifference is what transforms a bad joke into something more revealing. A glimpse into Clarkson's attitude towards certain celebrities. George Michael wasn't just the subject of humor. He was someone Clarkson felt comfortable mocking in a way he would never have attempted with others. There was no balance, no admiration to offset the insult, just ridicule. It's important to understand the Top Gear context here. The show thrived on pushing boundaries. Clarkson built his reputation on saying what others wouldn't, often disguising cruelty as honesty and prejudice as telling it like it is. For fans, this was part of the appeal. For critics, it was the core problem. The George Michael joke sits right at the center of that debate. Supporters argued it was harmless banter, no different from the way Clarkson mocked politicians, cars, or even his co-hosts. But the difference is power. George Michael wasn't in the studio to respond. He wasn't part of the joke. He was a distant target, reduced to a single aspect of his identity for cheap laughs. In retrospect, the moment feels like a warning sign, an early indicator of how Clarkson's brand of humor would increasingly clash with changing public attitudes. What once passed as edgy entertainment began to look mean-spirited, outdated, and unnecessarily hostile. George Michael's inclusion in this list isn't about a prolonged feud or repeated clashes. It's about a single defining moment where Clarkson's disdain was unmistakable. Broadcast to millions, defended by silence, and never walked back. Whether Clarkson truly despised George Michael as a person is ultimately unknowable. But on Top Gear, in that moment, he certainly treated him with contempt. And that, more than any later explanation or defense, is why this controversy still matters. You think that was harsh? The next encounter pushed Clarkson into even colder territory. Bob Geldof. Bob Geldof's appearance on Top Gear was never going to be an easy fit, but few could have predicted just how uncomfortable it would become. Unlike many celebrity guests who arrive ready to play along, crack jokes, and treat the segment as light entertainment, Geldof brought something Jeremy Clarkson has historically had little patience for: moral seriousness. From the opening moments, it was clear this wasn't just an awkward interview or mismatched humor. It was a clash of worldviews, and Clarkson made little effort to disguise his contempt. Clarkson has long been openly skeptical of activists, campaigners, and anyone he perceives as sanctimonious. He prides himself on irreverence and provocation, often framing earnestness as pretension. Bob Geldof, with his decades-long association with global aid campaigns, political causes, and outspoken moral opinions, represented everything Clarkson instinctively pushes against. On Top Gear, that resistance wasn't subtle. It translated into a tone that was noticeably sharper and more dismissive than usual. Rather than easing Geldof into the segment with playful humor, Clarkson went straight for mockery. He framed Geldof less as a respected musician and humanitarian and more as an overbearing crusader who took himself too seriously. Clarkson repeatedly undercut Geldof's achievements with sarcastic remarks, treating his activism as an inconvenience rather than a contribution. Even Geldof's music career was brushed aside, treated as secondary compared to Clarkson's insistence on portraying him as preachy and humorless. Throughout the interview, Clarkson made pointed comments about Geldof's activism, subtly suggesting that it was joyless, self-important, and incompatible with the spirit of Top Gear. When Geldof attempted to speak seriously about causes he cared about, Clarkson quickly shut those moments down. Instead of engaging with what was being said, he redirected the conversation back toward jokes at Geldof's expense, as if sincerity itself had no place on the show. Unlike some guests who retreat or laugh nervously under Clarkson's aggression, Geldof didn't entirely back down. He pushed back where he could, defending his positions and refusing to be reduced to a one-note caricature. That resistance, however, only seemed to irritate Clarkson further. The exchange grew increasingly tense, with Clarkson responding not through debate, but with exaggerated sarcasm and visible impatience. The result was an interview that felt fundamentally unbalanced. Clarkson wasn't simply teasing a guest, something he does to almost everyone. He was challenging the legitimacy of who Geldof was and what he represented. The usual rhythm of the star in a reasonably priced car segment never fully took hold. Laughter in the studio felt thinner and more hesitant, as though even the audience sensed the unease in the room. Even during the discussion of Geldof's lap time, a moment usually designed to unite host and guest, Clarkson remained dismissive. There was little encouragement, no shared excitement, and no effort to celebrate the result. Clarkson treated it as a non-event and quickly moved on, reinforcing the impression that Geldof was not a welcome guest but a disruption to the show's flow. Audience reaction mirrored that tension. Some viewers enjoyed seeing Geldof challenged, interpreting Clarkson's approach as a refusal to indulge celebrity activism or moral posturing. To them, Clarkson was simply doing what he always does, deflating seriousness with humor. Others found the segment awkward and unnecessarily hostile, arguing that Clarkson's contempt for Geldof's beliefs erased any potential entertainment value. Geldof's placement at number 1 is particularly significant because Clarkson's hostility wasn't driven by boredom or disinterest, as it was with guests like Hugh Grant. It was ideological. Clarkson wasn't annoyed that Geldof didn't care about cars. He was frustrated that Geldof cared deeply about things Clarkson didn't respect or value. That distinction matters. This moment reveals something important about Clarkson's on-screen persona. While he often claims to despise sanctimony, his reaction to Geldof suggests a limited tolerance for opposing worldviews. Clarkson doesn't debate. He dismisses. He doesn't challenge ideas. He freezes them out. There was no dramatic fallout after the episode. No headlines, no public feud, no formal complaints. But that quiet aftermath didn't weaken the impact of what viewers witnessed. If anything, it made it more revealing. Clarkson didn't explode. He made the guest invisible. Bob Geldof's Top Gear appearance serves as a reminder that Clarkson's disdain doesn't always come through shouting or shock jokes. Sometimes it shows up as impatience, sarcasm, and a refusal to engage. And that can be just as uncomfortable, if not more telling, than outright confrontation. 6 celebrities, 1 studio, and moments where the humor stopped and the tension took over. Top Gear was never just about cars. If you enjoyed this deep dive, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more, and click the next video on screen to keep watching.